Baby moves during the funeral and leaves everyone in despair, based on a true story. The air inside the small funeral hall is heavy with grief and sorrow. Family and friends have gathered around the small white coffin where 10-month-old Emilio lies. His mother Stella stands at the front, her hands trembling as she stares with tear-filled eyes at the lifeless body of her baby. Beside her, her husband Ernesto stands frozen, his fists clenched, his face stiff with unbearable pain. This is a moment of loss no parent should ever have to endure. The silence in the room is broken only by the soft sobbing of those present. The priest speaks gentle prayers, his voice filled with sorrow and compassion. Stella clings to Ernesto, her body trembling with unrelenting tears. Her mother-in-law strokes her back in a feeble attempt to offer comfort, but nothing can ease the searing pain in her heart. Emilio, her little boy, who just days ago was in her arms, now lies motionless in this tiny coffin. Her thoughts spiral around their last moments together. His smile, his soft babbling, his tiny fingers clinging onto hers. As the priest finishes, a close family friend steps forward to say a few words. But just as he begins, something unimaginable happens. A faint sound breaks the silence. At first, no one is sure if they actually heard it. But then, a movement, a barely noticeable twitch from inside the coffin. Stella's eyes widen in shock, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did I imagine that?" she whispers, gripping Ernesto's arm tighter. The atmosphere in the room shifts. A few guests exchange uncertain glances as Stella, with trembling hands, takes a hesitant step forward. She cannot explain why, but a deep, unshakable hope rises within her. Ernesto tries to hold her back, but she leans over the coffin. With a trembling hand, she gently places her palm on Emilio's tiny chest and feels something unmistakable. Warmth. Her breath catches. Her pulse races. Then, in a moment that sends a collective gasp through the room, Emilio's tiny hand moves. A hushed murmur spreads through the room as Stella gasps for air, her eyes wide with shock. Her fingers tremble as she touches Emilio's tiny hand again. It is warm, not cold, as she had expected. Ernesto, seeing the stunned expression on his wife's face, leans over the coffin as well. "This is impossible," he murmurs, his gaze darting between Stella and their son. But before he can process what is happening, Stella's Aunt Christina steps forward. With careful hands, she strokes the pale face of the baby, then suddenly recoils. "He's warm," she exclaims in disbelief while the mourners stare at the child in shock. The atmosphere in the room shifts. Some whisper in confusion, others stand frozen, their eyes locked onto the tiny body in the white coffin. Stella feels her throat tighten. She wants to believe it's a trick of her grieving mind, a cruel illusion of hope. But then, she feels it again. A barely perceptible movement beneath her hand. Her breath catches and a cold shiver runs down her spine. Ernesto, his face now ashen, places his own hand on Emilio's chest. There it is, a weak but undeniable movement. His fingers tremble, his thoughts race. This cannot be, or can it? The room erupts in panicked voices. Relatives and friends move closer, some filled with fear, others clinging to the possibility of a miracle. Stella hears nothing but the deafening pounding of her heart as she stares at her child's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Is it possible? Could Emilio still be alive? As the tension in the air becomes unbearable, Ernesto fumbles frantically for his phone. "We need a doctor," he shouts, his voice shaking with desperation. And in that moment, the horrifying realization crashes down on him like a tidal wave. They had given up on their son far too soon. Davi, a close family friend, bursts out of the room, leaving behind the frantic murmurs of the mourners. His heart pounds as he sprints through the streets, desperately searching for medical help. He reaches a nearby pharmacy, where Felipe, an experienced pharmacist, is restocking shelves. Gasping for breath, Davi stammers out the situation, his words tumbling over each other in sheer panic. Felipe doesn't hesitate for a second. Grabbing a medical emergency bag, He rushes back to the funeral hall alongside Davi. Back in the room, an electrified silence has fallen over the crowd as Felipe kneels beside the tiny coffin. Stella clings to Ernesto, trembling as she watches the pharmacist place his stethoscope on the baby's chest. The seconds stretch unbearably long as he listens intently, his face tightening with concentration. Then suddenly he stills. His expression shifts, growing more serious. Slowly, he lifts his head. I hear something, he says softly, and his words echo through the room like a thunderclap. A collective gasp spreads through the mourners. Stella chokes back a sob while Ernesto shakes his head in disbelief. Felipe checks Emilio's pulse, his brows furrowing deeply. "It's weak, but it's there," he finally exclaims, and tears of hope spill down Stella's face. At that moment, the paramedics, alerted by the commotion, arrive. They push through the stunned crowd, setting up their medical equipment in an instant. As they work, one of the paramedics, Rodrigo, scans the room, his voice sharp with authority. "Who declared this child dead?" A heavy silence falls over the gathering. Stella steps back, her confusion mounting as she glances at Ernesto. She had never questioned whether her son was truly gone. It had been the doctor, a doctor they had trusted. But if Emilio is still alive, that means... Ernesto clenches his fists, his jaw tightening with fury. "We were lied to," he murmurs, the realization searing through him like fire. Someone had made a terrible mistake, one that had nearly cost their son his life. Stella collapses into sobs as the horrifying truth sinks in. They had almost buried their child alive. Gasps and murmurs of shock ripple through the crowd as the paramedics carefully lift Emilio onto a stretcher. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," Rodrigo shouts. And with that, the race against time begins, the race to save little Emilio's life. The hospital is in a frenzy as Emilio is rushed to the intensive care unit. Stella and Ernesto stand frozen in the hallway, their emotions a whirlwind of shock and desperation, while the doctors fight for their son's life. Just moments ago, they thought they had lost him forever. Now hope flickers once again, but it is laced with fear and burning anger. How could their baby have been declared dead? A doctor with a serious expression steps out of the treatment room. "Your son is alive," he says, "but he is weak. We need to monitor him closely." The words hit Stella like a lightning strike, joy and relief intertwining with the stinging pain of betrayal. As Emilio is stabilized, Stella and Ernesto demand answers. They insist on seeing the doctor who made the misdiagnosis. Eventually, Dr. Moises, the responsible physician, is called in. But instead of remorse, he appears detached, dismissing the gravity of the situation with cold indifference. "It was a tragic mistake, but these things happen," he says. Ernesto snaps. "These things happen? You were ready to let us bury our son alive." His voice echoes through the corridor, drawing the attention of hospital staff and other patients. Dr. Moises glances around, realizing he is losing control of the situation. But it is too late. The truth has come to light. The case makes headlines. The media picks up the story, and soon, a full investigation is launched. The pressure mounts until Dr. Moises is finally suspended. Yet for Stella and Ernesto, only one thing matters. Emilio survived. Weeks later, they are finally able to take their son home. As Stella cradles him in her arms, she makes a silent vow. No other parent should ever go through this nightmare. They were given a second chance, and they will fight to ensure that no other child is ever declared dead while still breathing. What began as a tragedy turned into a miracle, but also an unsettling truth. Emilio's death was nothing more than a fatal mistake. Stella and Ernesto had nearly lost their child because they had trusted blindly, but against all odds, Emilio came back. This story is a reminder. Never give up. If this story moved you, leave a like, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories. See you next time.